When my son-in-law told me I should be grateful he was even letting me stay in my own house, the house my wife Carol and I had paid off over 31 years of working, he didn't know I had already spoken to a lawyer 2 days earlier. He didn't know I had copies of every financial document he had moved without my knowledge, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming. Before I go any further, please subscribe to Father's Earned Revenge and turn on notifications. We post new stories every week. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what city or province you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're tuning in. My name is Hugh Mercer. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 34 years working as a land surveyor for a firm out of London, Ontario. Carol and I raised 2 kids in the same split level on Elmwood Crescent, our daughter Tanya and our son Peter. Carol passed from ovarian cancer September of 2022, after 14 months of fighting. She was 63 years old, and she was the most organized, clear-headed person I have ever known. She had a will, she had a power of attorney, she had everything documented, because that was Carol. She didn't leave things to chance. What I didn't expect was that her death would become an opportunity for the man our daughter had married. His name is Shane. He and Tanya had been together since she was 26. He worked in residential real estate sales in Kitchener, which meant he understood property values, understood how titles worked, understood what things were worth. I never liked him, if I'm being honest. He had a way of talking that made everything sound reasonable even when something felt off. Carol used to say, "Hugh, give him a chance." I gave him 11 years. It started about 4 months after Carol's funeral. Tanya called me on a Sunday evening and said she and Shane wanted to come over to talk about some practical matters. That was the phrase she used. Practical matters. I figured they were going to ask about Carol's jewelry or whether I had plans for the lake property in Haliburton, a small cottage we'd owned since 1998. Carol had always said that Cottage would go to the kids eventually. When they sat down at my kitchen table, Shane did most of the talking. He pulled out a folder. He had printed documents. That was the first thing I noticed, that Shane had come prepared with printed documents to a Sunday afternoon visit to his grieving father-in-law. "We've been going over Carol's estate," he said, "and there are a few things we think you may have misunderstood about how the assets are structured." I told him I didn't think I had misunderstood anything. My wife and I had sat with our estate lawyer, Patricia Donovan, and gone over everything together in the spring of 2021, when Carol got her diagnosis. Shane slid a document across the table. Carol actually updated her wishes regarding the Haliburton property in August of 2022. This transfer of ownership form shows that she intended to move the cottage into a joint family trust, with Tanya and I as co-trustees. I looked at the paper. Carol's signature was at the bottom. I felt something cold move through me, but I kept my face neutral, because here is something Shane did not know about my wife. Carol had a small tear at the bottom of every important signature she ever made. A tiny upward flick on the last letter of her name, like a little wave. She had done it since she was a girl. She told me once her father had taught her to do it, so she would always recognize her own signature on a document. The signature on Shane's document had no such flick. "I'll need to look this over," I said. "Can I keep a copy?" Shane smiled and said of course. He was very gracious about it. That night, I went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom where Carol kept her personal papers. I found her actual will, the one Patricia Donovan had prepared, witnessed, and notarized in May of 2021. In that document, the Haliburton cottage was left to me outright. There was no mention of a family trust. There was no transfer document. The cottage was mine. I also found Carol's signed copy of the power of attorney, her registered retirement savings statements, and the deed to the Elmwood Crescent house. All in her handwriting, all with that little upward flick at the end of her name. I sat in that spare room for a long time, the same room where we used to wrap Christmas presents together. I could still smell her hand cream on the fabric of the chair, and I thought very quietly that Shane had made a serious mistake underestimating a man who had spent 3 decades reading land documents for a living. The next morning, I called Patricia Donovan. She was horrified. She told me she had not drafted any amendment to Carol's will in August of 2022. Carol had been in palliative care by that point. She was on medication, sleeping most of the day. The idea that she had independently arranged a property transfer in those final weeks was not just unlikely, It was impossible. Patricia told me she was legally obligated to report what I was describing to the Law Society, and she asked for permission to also contact the police on my behalf. I said yes to both. Over the next week, I did what I had always done when a property boundary was disputed. I gathered every piece of evidence methodically, and I built a complete picture before I made a single move. I contacted the Land Registry office in Haliburton County and confirmed that no transfer had been registered for the cottage. That told me Shane had prepared a document but had not yet had the chance to file it, or had not yet found a way to do so without my knowledge. He had shown it to me as a pressure tactic first, to get me to simply accept the new arrangement and perhaps sign something that would legitimize it. I contacted my bank, TD Canada Trust, where Carol and I had held joint accounts for decades. I asked the branch manager, a woman named Elaine who had known us for years, to flag any unusual activity and provide me with a full transaction history since Carol's passing. What Elaine found was not the cottage that had been Shane's opening move. What she found was a series of 3 wire transfers, each just under $10,000, made from Carol's estate account in November and December of 2022. The transfers had been authorized using a power of attorney document, a different version than the one I had in my filing cabinet. Shane had created 2 forged documents, one to transfer the cottage, one to drain the estate account, $27,000. It wasn't the largest number in the world, but it was money Carol had saved over the last years of her working life as an administrative coordinator at Thames Valley. Money she had set aside quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. I went back to Patricia Donovan with the bank records. She had already filed a complaint with the Ontario Provincial Police. The Financial Crimes Unit opened a file. A detective named Gary Ostrowski called me on a Thursday and spent 90 minutes on the phone taking my statement. He was thorough and patient. He told me that document fraud involving a deceased person's estate was taken very seriously in Ontario, and that the combination of a forged power of attorney and a forged property transfer was enough to pursue criminal charges. "How long before you have enough to move?" I asked. "We're already building the case," he told me. "What I need from you is to not confront your son-in-law yet. Let him think everything is normal." I could do that. I had been doing that for 11 years. What Shane did not understand, what I suspect he had never taken the time to understand, was that I was not the confused, grieving old man he thought he was dealing with. My wife had just died. I was sad, yes. I missed her every hour of every day. But grief does not make a person stupid. And watching Shane sit at my kitchen table with his printed folder, explaining my wife's wishes to me, had not broken me. It had lit something cold and clear in the center of my chest. I spent the following weeks doing 3 things. I met with Patricia Donovan to prepare updated documentation of my own estate, removing Tanya and Shane from any position of financial authority. I worked with the OPP Financial Crimes Unit, providing every bank statement, every letter, every document I could find, and I said nothing to Tanya. That last part was the hardest. My daughter was not a bad person. I believed and still believe that she did not know the full scope of what Shane was doing. But I also knew that if I told her prematurely, she would tell him, and Shane would begin covering his tracks. The detective had been very clear about that. So when Tanya called to check in, I talked about the weather, about the neighbor's dog that kept getting into my recycling bins, about the new Tim Hortons they were building on Clark Road. Normal things. Father and daughter things. I hated every second of that careful silence, but Carol would have understood it. Carol was practical above everything. In late January of 2023, Shane called me himself. He asked if I had given more thought to the cottage situation, and whether I would be willing to sign the trust documents to make things cleaner going forward. His tone was warm and patient, like he was doing me a favor. "I'm still reviewing things," I told him. "You know how it is. A lot to process." "Of course," he said. "Take your time, we're family." 5 days later, I received a call from Detective Ostrowski. He told me the OPP was ready to execute the next phase of the investigation, and that I should expect things to move quickly over the following week. He thanked me for my patience, and for the quality of the documentation I had provided. "Whoever organized your family's paperwork," he said, "did an excellent job." "That was my wife," I said. There was a brief silence on the line. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," he said. She was. On a Tuesday morning in the first week of February, two things happened within hours of each other. The OPP Financial Crimes Unit attended Shane's real estate brokerage office in Kitchener with a warrant. At the same time, a second team attended his personal bank branch with a court order to freeze his accounts. Shane was not arrested that morning, but he was formally advised that he was the subject of a criminal investigation into fraud and forgery, and that he should retain counsel immediately. I know all of this because Detective Ostrowski called me as soon as both actions were complete. I was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee in the same chair where Shane had slid that document toward me 4 months earlier. I thanked the detective, and then I sat there for a very long time. The first call from Shane came that same afternoon. I let it ring. He called 3 more times before he left a voicemail, his voice very measured and careful, saying that something had come up and that he would like to connect and straighten a few things out. He said he was sure there had been some kind of miscommunication and that families should handle family matters together. I didn't respond. He called twice more that evening, and 3 times the next morning. By the end of the 3rd day, he had called me 19 times. The voicemails shifted in tone. The first ones were calm and reasonable. Then they became confused, asking if I had spoken to anyone. Then one of them, the 11th or 12th, had a different quality entirely. His voice was tight, and he said, "Hugh, I don't know what you think you know, but I'm telling you, if you've been talking to people about our family's private business, you are going to regret it. You're old, and you're lonely, and you're not thinking clearly. Nobody is going to take your side on this." I saved that voicemail and sent it to Detective Ostrowski. Tanya called me on the 4th day. She was crying before she finished saying hello. She said she didn't understand what was happening, that Shane had told her it was all a misunderstanding, that I had apparently told lies to the police. I let her talk. When she had finished, I asked her one question. "Did you know about the document he brought to my house in October? The one about the cottage?" There was a long pause. "He said you were having trouble managing things on your own," she said quietly. "He said he was just trying to help organize everything." "Tanya," I said, "your mother's signature on that document is a forgery. Shane also used a forged power of attorney to wire $27,000 out of your mother's estate account. I have bank records, and the OPP has both documents." She didn't say anything for almost a full minute. When she spoke again, she sounded very young, like she was 16 again and had just been told something she didn't want to be true. "Dad," she said, "are you sure?" "I am completely sure." The silence between us was the most painful moment of this entire ordeal. Not Shane's threats, not the months of pretending. That silence from my daughter, when she understood that the man she had been married to for 8 years had used her mother's death as an opportunity. Over the following weeks, Shane retained a criminal defense lawyer, a move that cost him the last of his liquid savings. His accounts had been frozen pending the investigation, his brokerage suspended his license while the matter was under review, and the forged documents had been flagged by both the Land Registry Office and TD Canada Trust, meaning any further attempt to use them was impossible. He called me one final time, about 3 weeks into February. He had clearly been drinking. His voice was unsteady, and he cycled through several different strategies in the space of a few minutes, pleading, accusing, bargaining. He told me I was destroying his life. He told me Carol would have been ashamed of how I was treating him. He told me Tanya would never forgive me. I waited until he had finished. "Shane," I said, "Carol had a small signature mark that she made on every important document she ever signed. I noticed on the first evening you brought that folder to my house that her signature didn't have it. I have known for 4 months that you forged my wife's name. Every conversation we had after that night, I was already working with a lawyer and cooperating with the police." He didn't say anything. "You should speak to your counsel," I said. "Don't call this number again." He called 22 more times over the next 48 hours. I answered none of them. Tanya moved out of their Kitchener home in March. She stayed with her friend Kim for a month, then found a place of her own in Guelph. She and I talked on the phone more in those weeks than we had in years. Real conversations, not the careful Sunday check-ins we had settled into since Carol died. She told me she had suspected something was wrong with Shane for longer than she wanted to admit. She told me about money that had gone missing from their joint account. about plans he would cancel without explanation, about the way he would sometimes describe her parents, her family, in terms of what we owned rather than who we were. She wept about her mother, about the fact that Shane had looked at Carol's death and seen a financial transaction. I didn't try to rush any of that grief, I just listened. In May of 2023, Shane was formally charged with 2 counts of fraud over $5,000 and 2 counts of forgery under the Criminal Code of Canada. His defense lawyer negotiated a guilty plea on the fraud counts in exchange for a conditional sentence, 18 months, to be served in the community, with strict conditions including no contact with our family and mandatory restitution of the $27,000, to be repaid at $800 a month over roughly 3 years. He did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that. The justice system made a calculation I don't entirely agree with, but the record is permanent. His real estate license was revoked by the Real Estate Council of Ontario, and the financial consequences will follow him for years. Patricia Donovan told me that a fraud conviction in Ontario makes it nearly impossible to work in any regulated financial or legal profession. Shane built his identity around real estate. That door is closed to him permanently. The Haliburton cottage is still mine. Carol's estate was properly administered. The $27,000 has been returning to my account in monthly installments, and I have set up an automatic transfer of every payment into a savings account I have named in Carol's honor. When the restitution is complete, I plan to donate the full amount to the cancer care unit at Victoria Hospital, where Carol received her treatment. It took me a long time to decide what to do about Tanya, not because I was angry with her. I was never angry with her, but because I needed to be sure that what came next would be honest, not just comfortable. She came to the house on Elmwood Crescent one Sunday in the fall, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I made tea the same way Carol always made it, with the kettle that still has the little chip on the lid that I refused to replace. My daughter told me she was sorry, not a quick, functional sorry, a real one, with all the weight of everything she had failed to see, or had chosen not to see, for years. She said she kept thinking about Carol, about how hard her mother had worked to make sure everything was organized, everything was documented, everything was protected, and then how Shane had looked at all of that and decided to help himself to it. Mom would be so angry, she said. Your mother, I said, would have had him figured out years before I did. We both laughed at that. It was the first time either of us had laughed in what felt like a very long time. I told Tanya what I had decided. She would remain in my will. She was my daughter, and nothing that had happened changed that. But I had revised every document, updated every beneficiary designation, and ensured that every piece of the estate Carol and I had built together was protected by clear, witnessed, notarized paperwork. Patricia Donovan had a copy. My neighbor Roy had a copy. And there was a copy in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, in the same drawer where Carol had kept hers. I still live on Elmwood Crescent. I still go to the cottage in Haliburton in August the way we always did. I sit on the same dock Carol and I used to sit on in the evenings, and I drink my coffee, and sometimes I talk to her out loud like a person who has stopped caring what that looks like. I tell her about Tanya, about the cottage, about the chip on the kettle lid that I still can't bring myself to throw away. Carol spent 34 years planning carefully so that our family would be looked after. She signed every document with that little upward flick. She did not leave things to chance. Neither did I.